Hello. In this clip, we discuss two important aspects of the monopoly. We start with the welfare effects and we continue with the price discrimination. Let's look at the welfare effects of a monopoly. We use the perfectly competitive market as a base of comparison. In a perfectly competitive market, the marginal revenue and the average revenue lines will coincide. That means that the optimal choice will be where the inverse demand function intersects the marginal cost function. We also learned already that this is the situation when the total surplus will be the maximum possible. So, in a perfectly competitive market then, the total output will be QPC, and this will be at a market equilibrium price of PC, where PC stands for perfect competition. The blue triangle is going to represent the consumer's surplus, and the orange triangle represents the producer's surplus. In case of a monopoly, you can see that the monopolist will choose a lower output and will sell its goods at a higher price. Here, these 2 points are denoted as PM and QM, where M stands for monopoly. In this case, the marginal revenue curve is steeper than the inverse demand function. Let us see what happens to the surpluses. The blue triangle's area becomes smaller than before, which shows us that as a result of the monopoly, the consumer surplus will reduce. Even though the production level will decrease because of the higher sale price, the producer surplus, here this orange trapezoid, is going to have a larger area than the orange triangle in the case of perfect competition. Because instead of QPC, a lower quantity QM is traded in the market, some welfare will simply not be made because some of the consumers at given price will not be able to purchase the good. That means that that particular welfare is lost to the whole society. And we call this dead weight loss. So the dead weight loss here is represented by the gray triangle. A typical feature of the monopolistic market is price discrimination. As you saw in the previous slide, the producer's surplus could be higher than under a perfectly competitive market situation because part of the consumer surplus was transferred to producer surplus. That is, in case of a monopoly, the monopolist can increase its producer surplus at the expense of the consumer surplus. Using a single price for the market, however, put a certain limit on the ability of the monopolist to transform consumer surplus into profit. If, however, the monopolist is able to select and separate different consumer goods, that is, to segment its market, and it is possible to set different price for these different segments, then it will be possible to make even more of the consumer surplus into producer surplus. In the extreme case, actually all consumer surplus can be transformed into producer surplus. Let's look at the basic situation when we have a single price. As you can see, the limitation on the producer surplus is set by the fact that just the same price is charged for every unit of the good independently of who wants to buy it. This means that there will always be people whose reservation price is much higher than the monopoly price. So that part will become a consumer surplus. One way to reduce the consumer surplus and get more profit could be if somehow it would be possible to segment the consumers into two groups. So the firm would be able to charge two different prices depending on which group the consumer belongs to. As you can see, this will mean that some of the consumer surplus can now be transformed into a producer surplus. If it is possible to make three different groups of the consumers and all three can be set a different price, then even more of the consumer surplus will become producer surplus. Observe that as we increase price discrimination, the total output of the firm increased. This is very important because if we could charge everyone their own individual specific reservational price, then the profit maximum would lead to the monopoly's output being equal to the perfectly competitive market's output. Let's look at this. Let us look at the most extreme case of price discrimination, called the perfect price discrimination. This requires that the monopolist knows the preferences of every single consumer and that the monopolist is able to offer different price for each consumer. If this is true, then the monopolist can transform all the consumer surplus into producer surplus. Because now the whole total surplus in the market is the monopolist surplus, the maximization problem will yield the same solution as in a perfectly competitive market. So the output in a market where the monopolist applies perfect price discrimination will be the same as in a perfectly competitive market. The result is that deadweight loss will be eliminated. Let us look at the three main versions of price discrimination. The first degree or perfect price discrimination we have just discussed. It requires that the monopolist knows the preferences of every single consumer, which is a very unlikely assumption to make with the exception of some very few economic activities. This requires, for example, that there is just a limited number of consumers in the market and that the monopolist has a contact with them occasionally or sometimes very often so that it can judge the preferences of the consumer. This could be, for example, a law practice or a medical practice. Imagine a doctor who charges for the same treatment different price to the poor and to the wealthy. In this case, the poor would have access to medical service which they would otherwise not have, but in exchange, all the consumer surplus will go to the doctor. So as you can see, there are advantages and disadvantages of perfect price discrimination. Let us look at the second degree price discrimination. In most cases, the monopolist has a lot of clients. It is not possible for the monopolist to know the preferences of each consumers, and it is also not possible to set the price per individual. In this case, one solution could be to offer discount on high quantity purchases. You may assume that those who are more sensitive to price changes will be willing to pay more on a large amount of goods if per unit they can get that particular good cheaper than those who buy it separately. One example could be the multi-packing. You can buy candy bars or sodas individually or in a multi-pack. If you buy them in multi-pack, then per unit you don't have to pay as much as when you buy them individually. Of course, in order that this system works, the firm wants to make sure that there will be no third party which would just enter the market, buy the multi-pack good, and then sell them separately, because that would be nothing else than taking away the monopolist producer surplus. That's the reason why you will find a legal notice on all the items which are sold in multi-pack, namely that that particular item cannot be sold separately. And this is a regulation which is often enforced. Third-degree price discrimination wishes to, well, it aims to set the price based on the socio-economic characteristics of the consumers. This could be, for example, to offer a discount for students, or to distinguish between, so make prices different for children or adults in theater. And something like this happens when an electricity firm charges different price for peak and off-peak users.